So let me do a quick little book review, or I guess it'd be more of a book reaction, just off the cuff of a book that I just finished reading, Mere Christendom by Doug Wilson. Now, Doug Wilson, I know what a lot of people are saying. Doug Wilson, I know he's sort of a lightning rod, and people either love him or hate him. And I'll just go ahead and say I like Doug Wilson. I do. Now, I understand he's a Presbyterian, and I'm a Baptist. What of it? And I understand a lot of the controversies surrounding Doug Wilson, and to be honest with you, well, I'll say one of the controversies, for example, the federal vision controversy. And I'll be honest, I don't really quite understand the federal vision thing. I don't know if anybody really does, maybe 3 or 4 people. So, but I'll tell you what I did do. I did watch a video done a while back by with James White and Doug Wilson, and they were discussing the doctrine of justification. I think the whole point of that video was sort of to clear the air on these accusations linking with Doug Wilson with federal vision. He said he's backed off of some of the earlier things that he said. He doesn't fully embrace federal vision, blah, blah, blah. But when he was discussing what he believed about the doctrine of justification, it was sounded orthodox to me. And James White. James White, gave him a check mark approval. And so if maybe I'm just a dullard, I'm just not intellectual enough to understand all the nuances of everything, well, put me in the same boat as James White, okay? I'm in good company. So I don't think that's really an issue for Doug Wilson, and a reason why we shouldn't read his books. Okay. I'm also familiar with the more recent brouhaha with Kevin DeYoung writing about the Moscow mood. And I read his article. I thought it was a bunch of ado about nothing. It sounded like it was like, hey, all these other criticisms of Doug Wilson doesn't stick, so let's make up something else. I like Kevin DeYoung. Don't get me wrong, I like Kevin DeYoung, but I thought it was just, I don't know. I'm not buying it. And I kind of like the Moscow mood. Hey, Doug Wilson, if you know anything about Doug Wilson, I know a few people that are watching this video may not even know who Doug Wilson is. He's a pastor in Moscow, Idaho. Been around for a long time, and he's kind of known for his being very opinionated. He's very snarky and witty, and if you like that sort of thing, you're gonna like Mere Christendom. If you don't like that kind of thing, it might raise your eyebrows a little bit, because a Mere Christendom is classic Doug Wilson. With his wit and his sarcasm and his insight. You get it all in this book, Mere Christendom. I remember in the forward, it sounded like a lot of it was blog posts, previous blog posts that they sort of collated together and put it into a coherent book. And I think it was great. Do I agree with everything that he says in there? No. Like I said, he's Presbyterian, I'm Baptist. There's some serious differences in opinions on the issues that he's discussing here, the distinction between church and state, and how that's all to work out with Romans 13 and all the rest with theonomy and things like that. And so, there are some differences. However, I have to say, and I'm going to say this as a staunch Baptist, he makes some good points in his book. I'm just going to be honest. He makes some really good points in this book. One of his main points, sort of to set the groundwork for the entire book, the first section of the book, and I think it was like in 4 different sections, but he's basically pushing back against this myth of neutrality as far as the state goes, and I have to be honest with you, I was a little gun shy about that whole topic, because, the separation of church and state, a free church and a free state, that's a Baptist ideal. And he was pushing back on it somewhat, basically making the argument that experiment has failed, that there's no such thing as and Baptists sort of tangential to the true Baptist point of religious liberty and a free church and a free state, but there is sort of this underlying current that perhaps it's possible that the state would be completely neutral and allow things to take place, and Doug Wilson just explodes that. There's no neutrality. Um, to use the buzzword of theocracy that everybody's afraid of, that he talks a great deal about that. Theo, of course, theos, meaning God, ocracy, the law, theonomy, the law of God, theonomy, the law of God. Everybody's a theonomist. It's just whose God are we going to take their laws? And the secularists, make no bones about it, they have a God. They have a God. And it's Christ or chaos type of thing. And Wilson lays that out very clearly and snarky in his way, and he shows that they have their own morality, they have their own blasphemy laws, and so if somebody's God is going to be in charge, it might as well be ours. Is basically how he says it, and I'm like, he kind of has a point. With that. And so now speaking of theonomy, and Doug Wilson is a unashamed theonomist. I will say reading Doug Wilson has given me a little bit different take on theonomy. He's not a full on board classic theonomist in the same vein as Greg Bonson, for example. Even though I don't think he admits that. He loves Greg Bonson, and I love Greg Bonson, and I've read several of his books. And some of the things that Greg Bonson said, however, as far as theonomy goes, I had to disagree with. For example, Greg Bonson does not make the threefold division of the law from the Old Testament. The classic Reformed understanding that the Old Testament has moral laws, civil laws, and ceremonial laws. Greg Bonson says no. There's just the moral laws and the ceremonial laws. The civil laws are moral laws, and so he doesn't make a distinction between those two. Doug Wilson does, though, and I was kind of surprised by that. And so he calls himself a general equity theonomist, and I kind of like that terminology. General equity coming from the Westminster, or it's also in our 1689 Baptist Confession, London Baptist Confession of Faith, the 1689. That the Old Testament laws, the Commonwealth of Israel, have been abrogated, except for their general equity. And so Wilson mentions that several times in the book. Actually, has almost a chapter on how that plays out, and I thought that was good. I thought it was helpful. Now, where I would push back a little bit on that is he completely just rolls his eyes and poo-poos on the distinction between the first table and the second table of the law. Well, he makes a distinction between the first table and the second table of the law. But from a Baptist perspective, at least how I understand it, from a Baptist perspective, the state, and that's what we're talking about, the state's role. Remember, the state has the authority, Romans 13, to wield the sword, to protect, to promote the good, and to punish evil. Well, who gets to decide what is good and what is evil? And that's sort of the fundamental question. And so we would say God does. Well, somebody's God does, and we figured it might as well be our God that does. And where do we know where God talks about good and evil? In the Ten Commandments, the moral law, the Decalogue. And so, but back to Baptists historically have said that the state governs the second table of the law, the second half. The do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness to neighbor. Those laws are protecting human life, protecting the sanctity of marriage, protecting personal property, and not bearing witness against your neighbor, having truth telling, and honoring contracts and all those kind of things. That's what the state's purview. And just so you know, America is miserably failing in some of those things. Thou shalt not murder. Yeah, not going so well in America today, especially if you're an unborn child. Protecting the sanctity of marriage. Yeah, not so much with a Burgerfield and things. And so that's why Wilson's saying it isn't working. But to the first table of the law, He seems to be arguing that the state should also enforce the first table of the law, and how, at least how I understand, Baptists have historically said that the state doesn't enforce the first table of the law, but they do protect the first table of the law. And so that's where religious liberty comes from, because the first table of the law deals with who we're to worship, have no other gods before me; how we're to worship, make no graven images; why we're to worship, not to take the Lord's name in vain; and when we're to worship, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. That's what the first table of the law is dealing with, our worship. And so the government, or the state government, should be protecting that and allowing for religious liberty. He seems to argue that we shouldn't make that distinction. The state should be enforcing those things, even though we might be a while before we can fully go after the first blasphemer first. And that, which was a good chapter, by the way, explaining that if the state has the authority to uphold blasphemy laws, then the state gets to blaspheme with impunity. Interesting point that he makes there. And so I would encourage you to read the book. I would encourage you to read the book. He talking about some good things. Where else was I with that? Well, speaking of Baptists, well, there was a couple of things that I didn't quite get how I understood the myth of neutrality. I'm with him, and I think he raises a great point. This thing needs to be discussed some more. How does that then play out? And one of the ideas that he kind of floated was the official adoption constitutionally of the Apostles' Creed. And I kind of see where he was, what he's trying to do there, because it's somebody's God. And if God didn't come to earth in the person of Jesus Christ, die on behalf of all those who believe, and then on the third day rise from the dead, if that's true, we have one reality. If that's not true, we have another reality. And so there's a clear distinction there. And so adoption of the Apostles' Creed as this big umbrella that all of we as Christians in a Christian state, mere Christendom, would uphold to. I see where it's going. Two huge problems with that, though, that I see that are worth discussing. I'm not completely just ignoring what he's saying. It's just worth discussing. Is how would that play out practically? I don't know. And then secondly, also note that the Apostles' Creed is a broad Trinitarian document. I mean, it's a short document. I believe in God the Father. I believe in the Son, the Holy Spirit. There's no statement about the authority of Scripture in the Apostles. There's no statement on the authority of the Decalogue in the Apostles. And so I wasn't quite sure how he was fleshing that part out. If we're going to say it's God's law, biblical law, the moral law, the Decalogue, it should be the law that is being enforced by the sword, by the state, and the Apostles' Creed is what is enforcing that if the Decalogue's not in the Apostles'. See what I'm saying? So that was a question. I'm not saying that it's not worth discussing. And I'm a post-millennialist like he is. We got a long time to discuss this. And so he's advancing the ball down the field a few yards. And so I think that's a good thing. And so, but basically, bottom line, another thing that I was going to say is, some people say, well, and already some people are listening to this, or especially if you're Baptist, church in a free state and all that stuff, it starts to make you nervous. And we as Baptists ought to be nervous because, as he said, it's in the book that there are many who would say, okay, Pastor Wilson, if that's true, wouldn't that put a fine upon Baptists who don't see the Abrahamic covenant correctly? And he said, well, yeah, that's a danger. That's a possible danger. But what's the alternative? The secular paradise that we live in now, today, where Baptists today are being fined for homeschooling their children in Baptist theology. That Baptists today are being fined for having Bible studies in residential areas that are not zoned for that sort of thing, where Baptists today are being fined for not using the right kind of light bulb or not separating their garbage into the recycle bin. You know, he said, I don't want that kind of secular paradise. And I'm like, so let's lay off on the Baptist. And I almost heard him say it, even though it wasn't in the text, for now. And so you can see why I'm not fully on board with this mere Christendom idea. However, I'm not opposed to it either. I think that it's worth reading, it's worth discussing, it's worth thinking about, and I'm going to go ahead and cut it off there because there's a lot of other things I'm saying. Like I said, this was not a full book review, but a reaction, and I give the book a thumbs up to read. It was, like I said, enjoyable. If nothing else, I just love reading Doug Wilson. He's a wordsmith and he words things well, and he gives us a lot of things to talk about. And so I'm going to go ahead and cut this video off short because I want you to get off of YouTube and go read a book. And a great one would be Mere Christendom by Doug Wilson. I try to remember to put a link in the description.